Let's talk a little bit more about flails. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, hopefully most of you will have seen recently on Todd's channel, we recently did a collaborative video looking at the flail. And now I've talked about flails on my channel before, in fact quite a bit, probably more than most other YouTubers on these sort of topics. But I'd never really tried to use that particular type of flail, and Todd sprung one on me. So thanks for that. It was a great experience, and also we had luckily at Fight Camp, my annual event, we had a bunch of people who had sparring versions of flails, and we had a little play with those and saw how things panned out. But I feel that the topic of flails is not done yet. Not only were there different types of flails, different lengths and sizes, there was this kind of shorter kind of ball on a chain type, and then there's a big articulated pole weapon type. But there's a whole bunch of questions about why were they used, why were they not used more widely, who used them in what contexts, and you know, what advantages do they have, what are they specifically for? So that's what I'm going to try and address a bit in this video. But before I go on, this video is sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends, who are making these videos possible. So let's have a little look at that fantastic game. Something that Raid Shadow Legends is famous for is its awesomely designed champions and their lore. And of course you can't have a fantasy world without dwarves, and Teleria is no different. So let's have a little bit of a delve into the dwarves of Raid Shadow Legends. Use my link below or the QR code to download Raid right now onto your mobile phone or PC. The third race made during the time of creation, they've largely kept themselves apart through history, interacting with the other kingdoms only through trade emissaries and go-betweens. Their society is split across a rigid caste system of delvers, craftsmen, and the dwarven nobility and priesthood, and you can really see it in the artwork. Not long ago, Siroth's demonic forces tried to invade the dwarven kingdom. The dwarves won at great cost, and their king gathered an army to march to the surface and join the common cause with the forces of light against the darkness, ending over 1,000 years of non-alignment. The dwarves of Teleria look absolutely awesome, and they look like a real society. There's a lot of variety amongst them. There are kings, nobles, sorcerers, evil-looking ones, even a barmaid-looking one. So one of my favourites is the Mountain King. I just think he looks like the archetypal kind of badass king dwarf, and I love his beard. And of course for this video, the Underpriest Brogni is particularly apt because he has a flail-like articulated weapon. And he just looks like a badass as well. He looks really, really cool, and I love that weapon for this video. What I love most about Raid is it's really fun to jump into. You can play anytime, it's game in your pocket, it's ready to go. And it's got some really good ways of battling either in the dungeons or in the arena. I personally love the arena battles because I like the idea of fighting against other people's teams. This month, Raid has just released a huge new Doom Tower update. There are two huge new bosses to take on, Astronax the Dark Fae and Bommel the Dreadhorn, along with new enemy balance on tower floors, new secret rooms to discover, and most importantly, new artifact sets to win. And if that's not enough for you, the whole month is packed with awesome events and tournaments, including one very special event with a brand new feature, Super Raids. Super Raids lets you double up your rewards from hitting dungeons and massively speed up your progress. This is amazing for new players, and if there was ever a great time to start playing, it's right now. If you want to get a huge head start in Raid, all you have to do is hit the link in my description below or scan the QR code on screen and you'll get an epic hero, Chonoru, who's amazing in the Doom Tower, 200k silver, 1 XP boost, 1 energy refill, 1 ancient shard, so you can summon an awesome champion as soon as you get into the game. All these rewards will be waiting for you up here in the inbox. And remember, this is only for new players and only for the next 30 days. Once you're in game, you can find me under the name Captain Context, of course, and if you're quick enough, you can even join my clan. And it's that quick and easy, so either check out the link in my description below, scan the QR code, and I'll see you in game. So let's get back to the main topic of this video, which is flail. So we're going to look at what are some possible advantages of flails, therefore why were they used. We're also going to look at why possibly weren't they used more, because we know they weren't hugely popular weapons, but they were used in specific circumstances by some people in the medieval period. There have been, just before I go into those details, I just want to set a little bit of kind of modern context, as it were. There have been people in the earlier days of the internet who were talking about medieval weapons, who used to say, for example, this ball on a chain is a fantasy weapon. Despite the fact it's in lots of medieval movies, it's not something we see in actual medieval history or medieval artwork. They are wrong, okay? However, I want to caveat that point with it is true to say that these were not common at all in the medieval period as far as we can tell. Okay, so they're overrepresented in modern kind of movies and TV series and things like this. But they did exist, they do appear in medieval art. But more common than this type of ball on a chain, which is the only type I have to hand, unfortunately, is the type that Todd reconstructed. That is essentially two articulated shafts that have either a chain or some kind of loop belt connecting them, and one part is essentially the polearm handle and the other part is the hitting head, and these absolutely are featured in quite a lot of medieval art, which shouldn't come as a huge surprise, because indeed they are based on the agricultural tool, the flail. So the flail at its kind of basic state is for threshing crops, for getting the seeds out. Okay, so absolutely it is a typical medieval tool, and it appears in loads of medieval art, not just in Europe, of course, all over the world. And we get, you know, rice threshing flails in flails over in you know, Japan and China and so on and so forth. Now, I'm aware that, again, this is a bit of modern context, that articulated weapons, particularly the nunchucks, have received a bit of a hard time recently amongst some YouTubers, primarily Shad. Now, I might look at those at some point, but do you know what? There were so many response videos to Shad on that I decided to not get involved. I was actually quite happy to learn about that, because I don't know an awful lot about the nunchucks myself, but I do know something about the European equivalent, which is of a polearm size. So let's have a little bit of a look at those. Why were they used? Who were they used by? What context were they used in? What advantages do they have, in other words? And why weren't they used more often? So the first thing we absolutely have to say, and is definitely an advantage leading to why it was used for the flail, the simple flail of two sticks connected together, is it already exists. It's already a tool. So it's already something that exists for an agricultural purpose. And quite simply, we have to recognise, in the medieval world, very often levies were raised. They weren't very well equipped, so they went with whatever they had. They went with scythes, they went with pitchforks, they went with flails. So quite simply, at its birth as a weapon on the battlefield, the flail probably was a weapon of necessity, not necessarily of ideal choice. That person would have chosen a spear and a shield if they had a spear and a shield, but they didn't have a spear and a shield, or a halberd, or a sword and a shield, or whatever. So they had to choose a flail, because that was they looked around in their farm, they went, well, you know, I could use the pitchfork or the flail. I think I'll go with the flail. So quite simply, it's a weapon of necessity, ergo it's also cheap. I mean, it's actually free if you think about it. People have said to me on my channel many times, oh Matt, the flail's a very cheap weapon. Well, actually it's a free weapon, because it already exists. Something that already exists for agriculture and is paid for by that industry, it's there, so it's a free weapon. So absolutely, we have to list that as a major advantage to its use. It costs nothing, and we have to add to that, therefore the person who is using it is familiar with it, and those two things actually go hand in hand. The fact that it is a cheap, in fact free weapon, also goes hand in hand with the fact that the person using it is using it because they're familiar with it. They know how to swing it and not hit themselves or hit their hands, presumably, because they've used it, you know, week in, week out through the summer for threshing their crops. Okay, wheat, I think, probably. So absolutely they're familiar with it, they know how to use it. So those are major advantages. They might not be advantages necessarily over other weapons, but they are advantages for why that person chooses that weapon, and also potentially how they use it, because they're familiar with it. Now we're actually going to look at some reasons of why you might choose these over another weapon. So say, for example, you're not a levied farmer, agricultural worker, so you do have the choice of using a spear or an axe, or you know, some other kind of weapon. Why would you choose to use some form of flail? Well, first of all, I have to say, normally we're talking about the polearm length of flail rather than the ball and chain short thing that we're shown, that we've got here. These are usually shown used by armoured people, similarly to a mace. Okay, but some of the advantages are the same, particularly this one, and that is this bit, the flexible bit. Now, there are some inherent advantages to having a flexible arm on the end of your weapon, and we demonstrated this in the collaboration with Todd that we filmed at Fight Camp a couple of weeks ago. And that is quite simply that when you swing it at someone, how they defend against it, in whatever way they do choose to defend against it, is somewhat more difficult by virtue of the fact that you've got this flexible articulation on the end, whether it's a chain or whether it's just another part of the shaft, which is connected via a bending part, a sort of articulation, yeah. So 2 limbs essentially. So it is really difficult based on the fact that that is bending and flexing. It comes in at really unpredictable angles. When you do try and defend against it, you sometimes block and it still comes round and hits you anyway. And that can hit you anywhere. It can hit you on the arms, on the legs, on the head. I think people often fixate on heads, but wherever it's swung, however you try and defend against it, very often that thing will come around anyway and hit you to some degree somewhere else. And we also saw that even potentially with a shield as well. Even if you put a shield in the way, the thing can come around the shield. And surprisingly to us, one of the things that we noticed happened was the articulation actually coming around the shield and hitting where the arm would have been behind the shield. So that's an obvious thing, I suppose, but we have to absolutely list it up near here at the top because that articulation by its very nature is very hard to defend against. And I would add another element to that in which is related, and that's judgment. Now, if you do HEMA or reenactment or any other form of martial arts, even LARP, this kind of stuff, you will find that whilst you might learn lots of techniques with weapons, fundamentally most combat, striking combat at least, with weapons or even unarmed if you're striking, punching and kicking, comes down to timing and distance. And there is something about these articulated weapons when used in combat or sparring, practice combat, that makes it more difficult to judge. Okay, so your judgment is thrown off by them, both in terms of distance and, as we've mentioned, in terms of how to defend against them. So connected to this feature of the weapon is also the fact that these articulated forms of flail are able to indirectly hit the target. Now, we've already talked about someone who's trying to defend or parry. That is obviously an effective thing there, whether they're using a shield or whether they're just putting a weapon in the way. The fact that the thing swings around is clearly an advantage and a major feature, probably the most prominent feature of this weapon. But additionally, you can actually extrapolate that articulation out into other contexts as well. Now, who were using these? So we've talked about perhaps levied troops using them because they were available, or they could quickly modify a farm flail into a combat flail by adding some spikes or studs into it or lead shodding it or whatever. But we specifically know that the Hussites were using them, and they were using them in conjunction with and in what we could call a war wagon. Okay, so essentially an armoured wagon with big wheels pulled by armoured horses, and they were using them out of there. Now, why might they be using them? Well, they might be using them because they're cheap, they might be using them because they're easy to make, but they could bear in mind that they were also using guns, bows, halberds, spears, this kind of things as well, and they were armoured. So I think that they were possibly using them because they are articulated. Now, if you imagine you're high up in some form of wagon, sometimes quite simply because you're inside this fortified wagon, you're going to have angles at which it's quite difficult to deploy your straight weapon. And in that kind of scenario, something which is articulated and bent could have advantages because it enables you to swing the thing around at angles which the other weapons might not be able to get to. Additionally, the people who are around there and defending, and this comment you could take to apply to any type of combat on foot. In fact, if in their brains they are used to defending against the things which are coming in straight lines at them, mixed in with those guys, if you've got people who are swinging things which don't come in straight lines at them and are more difficult to block, it's quite difficult to switch between those two modes, and it comes back to the judgment comment again. So I do think striking around things, coming around things, is sometimes important, not only to combat, one-on-one like we've looked at, coming around someone's weapon or shield or whatever, but additionally sometimes around, let's call it mobile fortification as it was. So let's go coming around the walls of the war wagon, and potentially even in kind of siege type situations where someone is behind a wall and maybe you're on a ladder. If you've got a straight weapon over here, you can't hit them because they're up on top of that wall. But if you've got a flail of some kind, you can swing at that wall and you will know that this thing will hit the top of the wall, swing around and potentially hit them around the edge of that. So I think being able to strike around things is actually a really useful thing for specific purposes by specific troops. Now here's another factor which funnily enough came up during our testing at Fight Camp on Todd's video, and that is the element of fear. Now when we're talking very kind of dryly in our garages or studies or wherever in our back gardens talking about the use of weapons like this, I think it's often easy to forget that a big element of how weapons function in the real world is intimidation and fear. Okay, and you know, the best weapon is the weapon you don't have to use. Yeah, the weapon, for example, we talked about bayonets in previous videos. Very often bayonets didn't cause a lot of casualties, but they forced an enemy to retreat. That's a perfect weapon. If your weapon, I mean, we could go into nuclear weapons here as well if you like, but I'm not going to go down that road. But if a weapon like a bayonet achieves the goal of driving the enemy out of a building or out of a trench or to abandon the hilltop, just from the fear of the bayonet charge, the bayonet doesn't need to kill enemy combatants. Remember, in most war, in most periods of history, most soldiers don't die. Most soldiers give up, surrender, get captured, flee, sometimes die of disease. But soldiers being killed by weapons is not normally what decides the outcome of a war or a campaign. So, quite simply, if a weapon is intimidating, for example a pike block, if you have a pike block who occupy a piece of ground, they will drive the enemy from it, they'll inhibit the ability of cavalry to go there and be effective there. So that's very, very effective. Now, flails, on a one-to-one basis, flails are intimidating. And you even get this, I'm not going to go down the nunchuck route, but you even get this with something like nunchuck, which is articulated because people don't know how to defend against them, because they strike around corners, because they come in at unpredictable angles, because they are conceptually more difficult to deal with, they are fear-inducing. Now, put that within a group of infantry soldiers, some of whom have got spears, some of whom have got halberds, some have maybe got a sword and shield. If they're operating together in a group and you mix in a flail guy in there. Now, this is incidentally ties in with some of my thoughts on the Dane axe. I'll just grab my Dane axe down here. I think, personally, that the Dane axe was heavily used in conjunction with spear and shield guys. And so to a certain extent, the Dane axe guys didn't have to worry about defending themselves. They were just looking for big openings in the shield wall where they could smash someone in the head with the Dane axe from far away, probably from behind the line of spear and shields. And I suspect that flails and sometimes two-handed swords, and we see this in art as well, it's supported by certain art, were used in a similar way. They were used for fear-inducing sniping attacks where the flail guy is not worrying about having to defend himself. He is simply looking for that opening where he can swing his flail at someone, they don't know how to defend against it, and that really disrupts the unity, the cohesion and the morale of the enemy by having that sort of enemy mixed in with other more conventional weapons. So before I look at some reasons why they weren't more popular than they were, I just want to briefly address the point of, do flails hit harder? Well, we have some anecdotal evidence in the modern reenactment and HMB type Battle of the Nations type world in that articulated weapons are often disallowed. Now, the reasons for them being disallowed in modern recreational combat are several. They can include, for example, the fact that you can't pull a blow with one very easily. You can either swing it hard or not swing it at all. You can't really swing it softly like you can with a normal stick or sword or spear. Okay, so that's one reason. Another reason is safety of spectators and people around, because they have a tendency to break. And if they break, the end goes flying off somewhere with quite a lot of momentum, like a trebuchet shot. So there's that potential argument as well. But there are some people that say that they literally hit harder. Now, I know that Shad and other YouTubers, and just people on the internet in general actually, have recently gone into the whole big stick energy debate, and the fact of does a nunchuck, for example, hit any harder than a stick does. I'm not going to get into that here because that is a massive topic, and it is something, certainly in conjunction with flails, that I think we will be looking at in the future. Maybe Todd and I will look at that in conjunction. There are ways of measuring energy of strikes, and I think it would be a very interesting experiment to do some scientific testing, of course, for science, between strike energy between articulated things like flails of various sorts, not just this ball and chain type, but obviously the two sticks articulated type, versus more conventional large stick weapons, be it a long stick or a quarterstaff or a cudgel, or indeed something like a halberd or a poleaxe or something like this. And comparing weight for weight as well, because obviously in some cases, if you can make a weapon lighter but still hit as hard, that's advantageous. It doesn't necessarily need to hit harder. If you can make it lighter, that might be useful because it might be quicker. And so anyway, it'd be interesting that we get into the whole basic Newtonian physics, but essentially we're looking at inertia, we're looking at momentum, we're looking at impact energy. So these are things which I think need to be done scientifically, and I'm not going to go into any great depth here. But purely to say that there is a question to be had about the fact that do these weapons hit harder? I don't know, but we need to find out. Okay, so just to finish up, we're going to briefly look, I'm going to rattle through the points of why weren't flails used more? And this is a good question. You might have answers. I'm only going to present, I think, sort of a couple of points, 3 points maybe here, on why I don't think they were more popular. If you can think of other reasons, by all means post in the comments below. I love it when you post comments. It promotes new ideas for new videos, great discussion, and it's good to see the community talking with each other. So the first obvious point that comes to my mind for why they weren't used more is because they're bloody dangerous. Okay, so because they are unpredictable, yeah, that's great if you're just hitting one person, but if you're operating as part of a group of people, then potentially these weapons are dangerous to the people standing next to you and behind you. Okay, so they are really, they can bounce off things. You can strike someone's helmet and this ball will bounce off at a funny angle and hit your friend over there. So the problem is they are unpredictable, and as we saw, look at my hand, they can also be dangerous to the user. Now, if you notice I haven't actually hit my hand any of the time here. If you're actually used to swinging something around, generally speaking, you're not going to hit yourself on the hand because you know how to decelerate the thing. But accidents happen, and when I was filming that video with Todd at Fight Camp, I did indeed draw blood on my own hand from one of those spikes. Not badly, just a scratch. But the fact is that these weapons can be dangerous to the user, and your friends and the enemy as well, but they're just unpredictable, and unpredictable can be an advantage and a huge disadvantage. In my mind, the other major disadvantage of flails is that they are not particularly versatile. They're kind of one-trick ponies, okay? So they can do one particular type of, very unpredictable, very offensive attacking very, very well. But they are really not good in defense at all, and they're not very good when you come in close. And if someone manages to close in on you or just kind of block one somehow, then they're very easy to grapple because they're quite easy to grab. You just wrap your arm around and just grab it with your hand. So they're not very versatile weapons. You can't, unlike something like a spear, for example, you can't easily prevent cavalry coming in and attacking you with them. They don't have a point on them, and they don't have really a huge amount of length either most of the time. The ones that we see in art are usually, the main shaft is usually only about head height, and obviously the shorter ones are more equivalent to maces and swords. So they're not very versatile weapons. They're basically good for hitting stuff with, and they're not very good for anything else. They're not good in close. They're not particularly good, I don't think, against cavalry. And they can be grappled relatively easily. So the final speculative reason of why they might not have been more popular, but I'm going to caveat this, is that they're not fancy. What do I mean by that? Well, quite simply, they're agricultural tools. So if we go back all the way back to the beginning of this video, the simple fact is that they are agricultural tools. They're common things. So anyone living in the medieval world who lived in an agricultural society would have seen flails around all the time. They're not necessarily intimidating to most people, certainly not anyone who worked near farms. And they don't look like they mean business. They look like they might be amateur. Okay, so for example, if you want to raise a body of men who look like professional soldiers and follow you around, if you're a lord or kind of knight or whatever, and you want a retinue, you want your retinue to look badass, okay? And badass soldiers have specially made and expensive weapons. You equip your men with nice livery coats and bits of armour and nice salets and polearms, you know, halberds or partisans or whatever. And if you give them flails, it might make them look like they're crap, basically, like they're levied farmers. Now, where's the caveat here? The caveat is that we do know that flails were adopted even by emperors, Emperor Maximilian, for fun fighting purposes. So absolutely they were used in tournaments. They do feature in the Fechterbuch, in the treatises. Most famously, probably Paulus Hector Mayer shows them. So yeah, we can see both ways there. On one hand, it's a common, cheap agricultural tool. On the other hand, so they would have been familiar with it. On the other hand, maybe it is an intimidating weapon. And on the other hand, we've got several hands here now, it was featured in fencing treatises and Friedel and various other artistic sources, used by nobles as a kind of novelty peasant's weapon. So there we go. There's lots of questions raising. I think the fundamental reasons of why they were used by some people is because they have very peculiar and particular offensive qualities that made them particularly appealing to the Hussites, for example, and probably perhaps in certain types of siege situations, trying to hit people around barriers, this kind of thing. I think that that's probably likely. And if you mix an occasional one in with your body of infantry, it's probably going to disrupt the enemy, might create openings for the spearmen to stab into, this kind of stuff. And why wasn't it more popular? Because it's not a versatile weapon. I think that's the headline. It is a one-trick pony. It's really good at doing unpredictable, whopping great hits on people, but it can't do much else. Okay, it can't work as a spear, it can't work in close, it's relatively easy to grab and disarm off someone one-to-one. So there we go. As always, I am certain that I have missed some points that I could have mentioned in this video. Feel free to post your comments and thoughts below. Thanks again for watching. It's always great to have you here and I love reading your comments, so post away. And I'll see you back on the channel really soon again for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.